March 18, 1942. Akeno Army Flying School, Honshu, Japan. Captain Takeo Tanimizu's hand traced the rivets along the P-40 Warhawk's fuselage as morning sunlight reflected off its freshly applied Japanese Hinomaru markings. The aircraft had arrived 3 days earlier, disassembled and crated, from Clark Field in the Philippines, where it had been captured intact after American forces abandoned the base in January. This is their frontline fighter, their answer to the Zero. But the weight! The maintenance logs lay open on a makeshift table beside the aircraft. Tanimizu, a veteran test pilot with 2,400 hours and combat experience over China, had just completed the first taxi tests. The control response felt heavy, sluggish. The weight distribution was unlike anything in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force inventory. "Captain, the armorers have completed the examination," Lieutenant Yamada reported, approaching with a clipboard thick with technical notes. "You need to see this." They walked to the rear of the fuselage where access panels had been removed. Yamada pointed to the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. 12.7 millimeters of hardened steel, here and here. He indicated the sections protecting the pilot's back and head. Total weight, 97 kilograms, just for pilot protection. Tanimizu knelt to examine the fuel tanks. His fingers found the rubber lining, thick, layered, self-sealing. And the tanks? Self-sealing throughout, multiple layers of rubber and neoprene between the aluminum shell and the fuel. Each tank weighs 40% more than our standard configuration. Combined with the armor, we calculate approximately 340 kilograms devoted entirely to protection systems. 340 kilograms. That's the equivalent of another entire engine mount or 150 kilometers of additional range, or... Tanimizu stood slowly, his mind racing through the implications. The mathematics were inescapable. Every kilogram of armor was a kilogram not available for performance, maneuverability, or range. The Americans had made a choice, a fundamental design philosophy embedded in every rivet of this machine. The question was, had they chosen correctly? The Akeno Army Flying School had been testing captured Allied aircraft since 1937, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses to develop combat tactics. But nothing had arrived quite like this. America's primary single-engine fighter, the type defending the Philippines, Burma, and now Australia. Flying Tigers were making headlines with this exact model in China, racking up impressive kill ratios against Japanese aircraft. Now, Japan would discover why, or, more importantly, how to defeat it. The testing program would take 4 weeks. Captain Tanimizu would fly the P-40E against Japanese fighters, the Ki-27 Nate, the Ki-43 Oscar, and eventually even a captured Hurricane for comparison. Every flight would be measured, documented, and analyzed. Airspeed at various altitudes, roll rate, turn radius, climb rate, dive speed, stall characteristics. The Japanese military was about to receive a masterclass in American fighter design taught by America's own aircraft. What they would discover would reshape aerial combat doctrine across the Pacific for the next 3 years. The journey to this revelation had begun nearly 2 years earlier, when the United States Army Air Corps issued specifications for a new single-engine pursuit fighter on March 28, 1940. The world was already at war. France was about to fall. Britain faced the Luftwaffe alone. American military planners watched the skies over Europe and drew urgent conclusions about modern air combat. The Curtiss-Wright Corporation responded with the P-40 Warhawk, an evolution of their P-36 Hawk design. The first production P-40E models rolled off the assembly line at Buffalo, New York in August 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor. The E variant represented a significant upgrade. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns with 1,470 rounds of ammunition total, compared to the earlier variants 2.5 cals and 4 30 cals. The Allison V171039 engine produced 1,150 horsepower at takeoff. Maximum speed reached 360 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Combat range extended to 850 miles with external tanks. Empty weight, 6,350 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight, 8,840 pounds. But the numbers that would matter most were the ones devoted to survival. That 97-kilogram armor plate, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the armored glass windscreen. These were lessons learned from Europe, where Spitfires and Hurricanes with armor survived while unprotected aircraft burned. The P-40E first entered combat on December 7, 1941, at Wheeler Field and Bellows Field, Hawaii. Of the few P-40s that managed to get airborne during the Japanese attack, Second Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor shot down 6 Japanese aircraft between them. The P-40 had proven it could fight. By January 1942, P-40Es equipped the 3rd, 17th, 20th, and 24th Pursuit Squadrons in the Philippines. When Japanese forces invaded Luzon on December 22, 1941, American pilots flew desperate missions against overwhelming odds. The P-40s performed well in diving attacks, using their weight and speed to strike fast and disengage. But Clark Field fell to Japanese ground forces on January 2, 1942. In the chaos of evacuation, several damaged but repairable P-40Es were left behind. Japanese engineers arrived at Clark Field on January 4, 1942. Among the wreckage and abandoned equipment, they found treasure: 3 P-40E Warhawks in various states of damage. One had sustained only minor damage to its landing gear, entirely repairable. Technical intelligence officers from the Koku Gijitsu Kenkyuyo Air Technical Research Laboratory immediately ordered the aircraft's preservation. By January 8, recovery teams had begun disassembly for transport to Japan. The captured aircraft, serial number 41-5205, had belonged to the 17th Pursuit Squadron. Its pilot, First Lieutenant Boyd Wagner, had escaped to Australia. His aircraft would go on a very different journey, back to the enemy's homeland, where it would betray every secret of American fighter design. Similar captures occurred in Burma. When Rangoon fell on March 8, 1942, Japanese forces discovered 2 more intact P-40Es at Mingaladon Airfield, abandoned by the retreating British and American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. One of these aircraft, bearing Flying Tiger's shark-mouth nose art, would become a propaganda icon when photographed with Japanese markings. But propaganda was secondary. The primary value was intelligence. By March 1942, Japan had captured at least 5 operational or near-operational P-40E Warhawks. 3 were selected for detailed technical analysis. One went to Akeno Army Flying School for flight testing. Another went to the Technical Air Arsenal at Tachikawa for structural analysis and systems testing. The third was retained in the Philippines for regional evaluation. The stage was set for one of World War II's most overlooked intelligence operations: the systematic reverse engineering of America's primary fighter aircraft by the enemy it was designed to defeat. Through April and May 1942, reports from Akeno Army Flying School filtered through Japanese military channels with methodical precision. Each test flight produced data. Each dogfight exercise revealed patterns. The picture that emerged would fundamentally alter Japanese fighter tactics across the Pacific theater. The roll rate analysis came first. Test pilot Captain Tanimizu flew the P-40E against a Ki-43 Oscar in mock combat on April 3, 1942. The results were documented with brutal clarity. At speeds above 300 km per hour, the P-40's ailerons required excessive force. Full deflection stick movement produced a 360-degree roll in 3.8 seconds. The Ki-43 Oscar completed the same maneuver in 2.1 seconds, 45% faster. At combat speeds, a Japanese pilot could reverse direction almost twice while the P-40 completed one roll. The American pilot commits to his direction, Tanimizu wrote in his report. Once in the bank, he cannot reverse quickly. This is exploitable. The turning performance tests followed on April 11, 1942. At 250 km per hour and 3,000 meters altitude, the P-40E required 22 seconds to complete a 360-degree level turn with a turning radius of approximately 280 meters. The Ki-43 Oscar completed the same turn in 15 seconds. 8 seconds with a radius of 195 meters. The numbers told a decisive story. In any turning dogfight, the P-40 would be on the defensive within seconds, presenting its profile to the more agile Japanese fighter. Japanese pilots had already experienced this advantage in combat. Over Rangoon in January and February 1942, Ki-43 pilots from the 64th Sentai had consistently outturned American volunteer group P-40s. What had seemed like pilot skill was now revealed as fundamental aerodynamic advantage. The testing at Akeno provided the mathematical proof. High-altitude performance testing on April 18, 1942, revealed another critical weakness. The P-40E's Allison V1710 engine lacked a supercharger designed for high-altitude operations. Above 4,500 meters, approximately 15,000 feet, engine power dropped precipitously. Maximum speed at 6,000 meters was only 510 kilometers per hour, compared to 570 kilometers per hour at 3,000 meters. Climb rate above 5,000 meters became sluggish, barely 8 meters per second compared to 15 meters per second at sea level. The Ki-43 Oscar, by contrast, maintained better performance at altitude, though it too suffered power loss. More critically, the lightweight Zero, not present at Akeno but well documented by this point, dominated high-altitude combat with its low wing loading and efficient supercharger. Japanese tactical analysts immediately recognized the strategic implication. P-40 pilots would avoid high-altitude combat when possible, preferring lower altitudes where their engine performed better. Japanese formations could use altitude advantage to dictate engagement terms. Dive testing revealed the P-40's genuine strength. On April 25, 1942, Tanimizu pushed the captured P-40E into a vertical dive from 5,000 meters. The aircraft accelerated smoothly to 750 kilometers per hour with no structural issues, no control flutter, no tendency to compress. The dive brakes, the aircraft's own structural strength and weight, allowed controlled high-speed descents that Japanese aircraft couldn't safely match. The Zero's lightweight structure risked catastrophic failure above 630 kilometers per hour in a dive. This is their answer to our maneuverability, the report noted. They hit from above, they dive through, they escape at speeds we cannot follow. If we turn to pursue into their dive, we present our vulnerable aspects. Firepower analysis completed the picture. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously produced devastating hit probability. Test firings against armored and unarmored target panels demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness. At 400-meter range, a 1-second burst put an average of 18 rounds into a 2-meter square target. Against the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks and structure, such firepower would be catastrophic. But the testing also revealed a tactical weakness. Ammunition capacity limited engagement time. With 1,470 rounds total across 6 guns, a P-40 pilot had approximately 31 seconds of continuous fire. Careful pilots firing in disciplined bursts could extend this to perhaps 15 to 20 separate engagements. But in a protracted dogfight with multiple opponents, ammunition exhaustion became a real concern. By May 1942, the Akeno Army Flying School had completed 67 flight tests, totaling 94 hours of flying time in the captured P-40E. The complete tactical profile was documented, translated, and distributed. The pattern was clear. The P-40 was a boom and zoom fighter, designed to attack from altitude, use speed and firepower to strike, and escape before Japanese fighters could leverage their superior maneuverability. American pilots who understood this and executed it well would be dangerous. American pilots who forgot this and entered turning dogfights would die. Bauman's combat doctrine would now be written to exploit these insights. But by mid-1942, as Japanese tactical manuals incorporating the P-40 analysis reached frontline units, the broader war situation began to expose a different vulnerability, one that the Japanese test pilots at Akeno had noticed but perhaps not fully appreciated. The moment of revelation came not from flight testing but from structural analysis at Tachikawa Technical Air Arsenal. On June 12, 1942, engineers completed their detailed examination of the second captured P-40E's protection systems. Chief Engineer Masahiko Nakajima drafted a report that would circulate through Japanese Naval and Army air commands with profound implications. The armor weight audit was comprehensive. Pilot seat armor, 97 kilograms. Armored glass windscreen, 11 kilograms. Oil cooler armor, 8 kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tank materials, 86 kilograms, total across all tanks. Armor for critical engine components, 12 kilograms. Combined protection systems weight, 214 kilograms, approximately 4.8% of the aircraft's maximum takeoff weight. Nakajima's report included a comparison to Japanese aircraft. The Ki-43-2 Oscar, entering production in late 1942, would include pilot armor, later variants, weighing approximately 35 kilograms. The Zero carried no armor protection through 1942. Even when later variants added minimal protection, total armor weight never exceeded 55 kilograms. The weight differential represented fundamentally opposed design philosophies. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, reviewing the report aboard the carrier Zukaku in July 1942, wrote a marginal note that captured the Japanese perspective. Every kilogram devoted to armor is a kilogram stolen from performance. The Americans choose to bring damaged aircraft home. We choose to prevent damage through superiority of maneuver. History will reveal which philosophy wins wars. But history was already beginning to answer that question in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until 1943. The self-sealing fuel tanks drew particular attention. Japanese engineers dissected the tank construction layer by layer. The standard P-40E tank consisted of an aluminum inner shell, a layer of vulcanized rubber, a layer of untreated natural rubber designed to swell when exposed to fuel and seal punctures, another layer of treated rubber, and finally an outer fabric covering. The system worked by allowing the rubber layers to expand into puncture holes when aviation fuel contacted them, forming an immediate seal. Test firings demonstrated the system's effectiveness. 7.7mm rounds penetrated but sealed within seconds. Even 12.7mm rounds, while causing larger holes, were largely sealed by the expanding rubber. Only explosive rounds or sustained fire from multiple angles could defeat the system. Japanese fuel tanks, by contrast, used simple aluminum construction with no sealing capability. A single incendiary round was often sufficient to ignite the entire fuel load. The test data was undeniable, but the Japanese interpretation of this data reflected their existing doctrine rather than changing it. The prevailing view held that the best protection was not being hit at all, and that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems allowed superior maneuverability to avoid being hit. This philosophy had worked brilliantly from 1941 through mid-1942, when Japanese tactical surprise, superior training, and numerical advantage in experienced pilots created conditions where avoidance was feasible. Japanese pilots could outturn, outclimb, and outrange their opponents. The Zero's legendary agility came precisely from its minimal weight. But combat pilot testimony was beginning to tell a different story. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, recovering from wounds received over Guadalcanal in August 1942, wrote bluntly in his after-action report, "I was hit by a single .50 caliber round through the canopy. The bullet fragments struck my head and destroyed my right eye. I remained conscious and flew 560 kilometers back to Rabaul. An American pilot with identical wounds would have been protected by his armored glass and suffered minimal injury. I will never fly combat again." Sakai's case was not isolated. Japanese pilot casualty rates began showing a troubling pattern by late 1942. When American pilots landed hits, Japanese pilots were killed or permanently disabled at rates far exceeding American casualties from similar battle damage. A P-40 or F-4F Wildcat could absorb multiple hits, catch fire, and still bring the pilot home. A Zero with identical damage became a coffin. The captured P-40 examination reports included a devastating statistical analysis compiled by U.S. forces, captured in turn from American intelligence documents found in the Philippines. American aircraft with armor and self-sealing tanks showed pilot survival rates of approximately 85% when battle damaged. Japanese pilot survival rates in comparable situations were estimated at 40–45%. These numbers represented Japan's fundamental strategic problem, pilot replacement. The United States was graduating thousands of new pilots monthly from expanded training programs. Japan's pilot training pipeline, though producing excellent aviators, could not match American scale. Every experienced Japanese pilot killed represented irreplaceable expertise. Every American pilot saved by armor returned to fight again, growing more experienced and dangerous. By early 1943, Japanese commanders faced an impossible dilemma. The captured P-40 analysis had revealed that American fighters were slower, less maneuverable, and inferior in rate of climb. But they were also far more likely to bring their pilots home. As the war progressed and American pilot experience increased, this survivability translated into a pilot force that grew stronger while Japan's grew weaker. The irony was profound. Japan had captured American technology, analyzed it meticulously, understood it completely, and still couldn't adopt its lessons. Japanese industrial capacity couldn't add 200+ kilograms of protection to their fighters without catastrophic performance losses. The engine technology gap meant Japanese fighters needed every advantage in weight and agility to compete. And cultural factors, the emphasis on offensive spirit, the warrior ethos that viewed heavy protection as defensive thinking, made wholesale adoption of American design philosophy impossible. The captured P-40 at Akeno had taught Japanese pilots how to shoot down American fighters by exploiting their weaknesses. But it had also revealed a weakness in Japanese design philosophy that would prove strategically fatal, though this second lesson would go largely unheeded. The requirements that produced the P-40's design philosophy originated in late 1939, as American military observers in Europe watched the early months of World War II with growing alarm. The United States Army Air Corps issued formal specifications on March 28, 1940, but the thinking behind those specifications had been evolving since the Spanish Civil War. American designers had access to detailed reports from RAF pilots flying Hurricanes and Spitfires over France and Britain. The lesson was unambiguous. Modern aerial combat involved high-speed slashing attacks where pilots had seconds, sometimes less than 1 second, to fire and escape. Dogfighting still occurred, but increasingly, Combat resulted from the attacker surprising the target rather than prolonged maneuvering engagements. In this combat environment, two factors determined survival: the ability to absorb punishment and the ability to dish out overwhelming firepower quickly. Maneuverability mattered, but not as much as it had in World War I. The specifications called for specific minimum capabilities: a top speed exceeding 360 miles per hour, a ceiling above 30,000 feet, 6.50 caliber machine guns with at least 200 rounds per gun, and, critically, armor protection for pilot and critical systems sufficient to withstand 7.92 millimeter armor-piercing ammunition at 300 meters. Curtiss-Wright Corporation's chief designer, Donovan Berlin, had previously designed the P-36 Hawk. The P-40 represented his attempt to meet the new requirements while leveraging existing P-36 design work to accelerate development. The Allison V1710 engine replaced the P-36's Pratt & Whitney radial, providing more power and better streamlining. But the armor and protection requirements created immediate problems. Berlin's team calculated the weight impact. Comprehensive armor protection would add approximately 185 kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks would add another 95 kilograms. Together, these protection systems would increase empty weight by roughly 280 kilograms compared to an unprotected design. The mathematics were brutally simple. The Allison V1710-39 engine produced 1,150 horsepower at takeoff. Aerodynamic drag increased with weight and with the additional structural elements required to support that weight. Every kilogram added to protection meant reduced climb rate, reduced maximum speed, reduced range, or reduced maneuverability, often all four simultaneously. Berlin's calculation showed that the 280-kilogram protection weight penalty would cost approximately 12 miles per hour in maximum speed, reduce rate of climb by 8%, and increase turning radius by approximately 6%. These were significant performance degradations. Against an opponent who prioritized performance over protection, the P-40 would be at a measurable disadvantage in most flight parameters. The impossible choice confronted every American fighter designer in 1940-1941. Build a fast, agile fighter that couldn't protect its pilot, or build a survivable fighter that would be outperformed by lighter opponents. Berlin chose survivability. His rationale was documented in Curtiss-Wright design memoranda from April 1940. Aerial combat in Europe demonstrates that pilot attrition determines air superiority more than aircraft performance. A pilot who survives a mission flies again tomorrow. A dead pilot, regardless of aircraft capability, contributes nothing to subsequent operations. Protection systems that increase pilot survival represent force multiplication across extended campaigns. The decision was further reinforced by projected wartime pilot production rates. American training facilities were expected to produce approximately 30,000 pilots annually by 1942. Actual production exceeded 100,000 pilots annually by 1943. But training produced novice pilots with minimal experience. The only way to develop combat-experienced pilots was to keep them alive long enough to gain experience. Armor and self-sealing tanks directly served this goal. Japanese designers faced identical physics but reached opposite conclusions. Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, had his own impossible choice in 1937 when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued specifications for a carrier-based fighter with extraordinary range, 1,600 nautical miles, high speed, over 500 kilometers per hour, and excellent maneuverability, all from an aircraft light enough for carrier operations. Horikoshi's solution was radical weight reduction. The Zero's airframe used extra super duralumin, an aluminum alloy stronger than standard duralumin but also more brittle and less damage resistant. Armor was eliminated entirely. Fuel tanks used simple aluminum construction. The result was an aircraft with empty weight of only 1,680 kilograms, nearly 1,000 kilograms lighter than the P-40E. This weight savings translated directly into performance. The Zero could outturn virtually any Allied fighter. Its 1,850-kilometer range allowed operations that other fighters couldn't match. Its 15.7 meter per second climb rate exceeded the P-40's 11.9 meters per second by over 30%. The Japanese justification paralleled Berlin's logic, but inverted the conclusion. The best protection is offensive capability. An aircraft that can outmaneuver, outrange, and outclimb the enemy will not be hit. Dead enemies do not shoot back. Performance superiority creates survivability through tactical advantage. Both philosophies were logical. Both were supported by valid reasoning. Both made sense within their respective strategic contexts. The difference lay in what happened when the assumptions underlying each philosophy failed. When a P-40 pilot made a tactical error, entered a turning fight, allowed an opponent into firing position, the armor and self-sealing tanks often gave him a second chance. The aircraft might be damaged, but the pilot survived to learn from his mistake. When a Zero pilot made an identical error, the lightweight structure and unprotected fuel tanks meant he rarely got a second chance. The aircraft burned. The pilot died. The lessons died with him. By 1942, both philosophies were being tested in actual combat across the Pacific. The captured P-40 at Akeno Army Flying School represented Japan's attempt to understand American design thinking. But understanding a philosophy is different from accepting it. Japanese industrial capacity, strategic requirements, and cultural factors locked them into their existing approach, even as evidence accumulated that the American philosophy might prove superior in prolonged warfare. The P-40 sitting on the ramp at Akeno, with its thick armor plate and rubber-lined fuel tanks, was a monument to American design conservatism, a willingness to sacrifice peak performance for pilot survival. Japanese test pilots flew it, analyzed it, and wrote detailed reports on how to defeat it. What they couldn't do was change the fundamental calculation. American industry could afford to build heavier fighters because American engines were more powerful. American strategy could accept performance penalties because American training produced replacement pilots in overwhelming numbers. And American culture, perhaps, valued individual life differently than Imperial Japanese culture did, though this was a difference in emphasis rather than absolute values. The design philosophy revealed by examining the captured P-40 wasn't wrong or right in absolute terms. It was optimized for American conditions, industrial capacity, pilot training scale, cultural values, and strategic objectives. Japanese design philosophy was equally optimized for Japanese conditions. The question wasn't which philosophy was better in a vacuum. The question was which philosophy would prove more sustainable in the specific conditions of the Pacific War from 1942 through 1945. And that answer would be written in blood across hundreds of battles, thousands of aircraft, and tens of thousands of lives. The tactical manual produced from the Akeno test program reached frontline units across the Pacific Theater by July 1942. Combat methods against P-40 type fighters was distributed to every fighter squadron in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces. The manual's recommendations were specific and unambiguous. Do not engage in prolonged turning combat at low speeds. The P-40's heavy weight and high wing loading prevent competitive turning performance. Japanese fighters will achieve firing position within 15 to 20 seconds of engagement. Do not pursue into vertical dives above 600 kilometers per hour. The P-40's structural strength and weight allow controlled dives at speeds unsafe for Type 0 and Type 1 fighters. Engage preferentially at altitudes above 5,000 meters, where the P-40's engine performance degradation creates advantage for Japanese types. If bounced from above, immediately enter turning climb. P-40 pilots attacking from altitude must either follow into turning combat where they are disadvantaged or break off attack. The P-40's 6 50 caliber machine guns create devastating firepower. Avoid head-on attacks. Avoid prolonged periods in firing arc. Attack from astern and below where pilot armor creates deflection challenges. These tactics worked. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, Japanese pilots applying the manual's recommendations consistently achieved favorable exchange ratios against P-40 units. Over Port Moresby, New Guinea, on August 11, 1942, 12 Ki-43 Oscars from the 11th Sentai engaged 8 P-40Es from the 8th Fighter Squadron. The American pilots, attacking a Japanese bomber formation, were bounced by the Oscars at 18,000 feet. Following doctrine, the Oscar pilots refused to follow diving P-40s and instead used superior climb rate to regain altitude advantage. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. 3 P-40s were shot down, 2 pilots killed, 1 captured. The Oscars suffered no losses. The tactical manual had predicted precisely this outcome. Similar patterns emerged over Darwin, Australia, Guadalcanal, and across Burma. Japanese fighter pilots who followed the anti-P-40 doctrine consistently won engagements. American P-40 units began suffering casualties that exceeded their replacement rates. But the victories masked a strategic problem that the captured P-40's examination had predicted, but Japanese command structure struggled to address. Every engagement produced the same result. P-40 shot down burned completely. Japanese aircraft shot down also burned completely. The difference was what happened to damaged aircraft that made it home. On November 5, 1942, Captain Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron returned to Port Moresby in P-40E serial number 4136084. His aircraft had taken 23 hits during a dogfight with Zeros over Buna. 7 rounds had struck the self-sealing fuel tanks, all sealed successfully. 4 rounds had struck the pilot armor, all deflected. 12 rounds had penetrated the wings and fuselage, causing structural damage but not compromising flight capability. Lynch landed safely, was examined by medical personnel, minor shrapnel wounds, and returned to combat operations 48 hours later. His aircraft was repaired and flying again within 2 weeks. The same day, Warrant Officer Takeshi Nakamura of the Tainan Air Group attacked the same American formation. His Zero took 5 hits, one of which penetrated the fuel tank. The aircraft erupted in flames. Nakamura bailed out at 2,000 feet, but his parachute caught fire from burning fuel. He was killed on impact. His aircraft was a total loss. More critically, his 650 hours of combat experience, irreplaceable expertise, representing 2 years of training and combat operations, died with him. This pattern repeated across thousands of engagements. The mathematics of attrition began working against Japan. By January 1943, American fighter pilot experience levels were beginning to match Japanese experience levels. By June 1943, American pilots were often more experienced than Japanese pilots because American pilots survived their mistakes while Japanese pilots didn't. The 8th Fighter Squadron, operating P-40s from Port Moresby, recorded these statistics from August 1942 through March 1943. 47 aircraft damaged by enemy fire and returned to base. Of these 47, armor had prevented pilot casualties in 31 cases, and fuel tank sealing had prevented fire in 23 cases. 29 of the 47 damaged aircraft were repaired and returned to service. Japanese units kept less comprehensive records, but captured documents and post-war interviews suggested that damaged Japanese fighters returned to base at roughly equal rates, but fire loss rates were dramatically higher. An analysis of the Tainan Air Group's records from Rabaul showed that of 38 fighters returning with battle damage during the same period, 27 subsequently caught fire either in flight or during landing. Pilot casualties from post-combat fires were nearly as high as casualties from being shot down during combat. The captured P-40's design philosophy, prioritize survivability over peak performance, was being validated not by winning individual dogfights, but by winning the attrition war. Japanese attempts to address the vulnerability problem came too late and proved inadequate. In early 1943, the Zero Model 32 entered service with limited pilot armor, a 35-kilogram plate behind the seat. But the armor was inadequate against .50 caliber fire at typical engagement ranges. And the weight addition, without corresponding engine power increases, degraded the Zero's already declining performance advantage. Self-sealing tanks proved beyond Japanese industrial capability to mass produce with available materials. Rubber supplies were constrained by the loss of Southeast Asian sources. The complex multi-layer tank construction required manufacturing precision that Japanese wartime production facilities struggled to maintain. Limited numbers of improved tanks were produced, but they never equipped more than a small fraction of the fighter force. By mid-1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The famous cases became legendary precisely because they illustrated the protection gap. On April 18, 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's G-4M Betty bomber was intercepted by P-38 Lightnings over Bougainville. The Lightning's .50 caliber fire ignited the Betty's unprotected fuel tanks. The aircraft exploded. Japan's greatest naval strategist died because his transport aircraft lacked self-sealing tanks. An American admiral traveling in a comparable B-25 Mitchell with protected tanks and armor likely would have survived the same attack. The final tally painted a devastating picture. From 1942 through 1945, Japan produced approximately 10,939 Zero fighters across all variants. Of these, an estimated 9,850 were lost to combat, accidents, or operational causes, a 90% attrition rate. Japanese fighter pilot casualties exceeded 15,000 killed, with thousands more wounded or permanently disabled. American P-40 production totaled 13,738 aircraft. Of these, approximately 2,400 were lost in the Pacific Theater. The survival rate was dramatically higher, and, more importantly, pilot survival rates were dramatically higher. When a P-40 was shot down, the pilot survived roughly 50% of the time. When a Zero was shot down, pilot survival rates were estimated at 20–30%. These numbers represented the real consequence of the captured P-40 analysis. Japan had learned how to shoot down American fighters. But American fighters were designed to be shot down and bring their pilots home anyway. Japanese fighters were designed never to be shot down, and when they were, almost nothing could save the pilot. Curtiss-Wright Corporation produced 13,738 P-40 Warhawks in all variants from 1939 through December 1944, making it the third most produced American fighter of World War II after the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-40E variant, specifically the model tested at Akeno, saw 2,320 aircraft produced between August 1941 and March 1942. Specifications: length 31 feet 2 inches, wingspan 37 feet 4 inches, empty weight 6,350 pounds, maximum takeoff weight 8,840 pounds, maximum speed 362 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, service ceiling 29,000 feet, range 850 miles with external tanks, armament 6.50 caliber machine guns with 1,470 rounds total. Later variants improved performance. The P-40N, the final and most produced variant, 5,219 built, reduced weight to 6,000 pounds empty through armor reduction, paradoxically coming closer to Japanese design philosophy as American air superiority made protection less critical. Maximum speed increased to 378 miles per hour. Distribution concentrated in secondary theaters. By mid-1943, American factories were producing superior fighters, the P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang, all with better high-altitude performance. P-40 production continued largely for Lend-Lease exports and for theaters like China, Burma, India, and North Africa, where high-altitude capability mattered less. Loss rates varied dramatically by theater and time period. In the Philippines campaign, December 1941, May 1942, P-40 losses exceeded 85%, but from all causes, including ground destruction. In combat air operations where the aircraft actually engaged enemies, pilot survival rates were consistently above 70% when the aircraft was shot down and above 90% when damaged aircraft made it back to friendly territory. Crew casualties, the metric that mattered most for sustained operations, told the strategic story. Of approximately 2,800 American pilots who flew P-40s in combat in the Pacific Theater, approximately 580 were killed in action, a loss rate of roughly 20%. This compared to Japanese fighter pilot losses exceeding 60% by war's end. The survivors' testimony provided the human context behind these statistics. Colonel Robert L. Scott, who flew P-40s with the Flying Tigers and later commanded the 23rd Fighter Group in China, wrote in his memoir, "The P-40 wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable fighter in the sky, but it brought me home 17 times when I should have died. 17 times I took hits that would have killed me in a Zero or Oscar. The weight everyone complained about, that's what kept me alive long enough to learn how to fight." First Lieutenant George Welch, who shot down 4 Japanese aircraft at Pearl Harbor flying a P-40, survived the war with 16 confirmed victories. In a 1943 interview, he stated, "The Japanese pilots I fought were better than me initially, more experienced, better trained, but their aircraft couldn't take punishment. When I made mistakes, and I made plenty, the P-40's armor gave me a second chance. When they made mistakes, they burned. By 1943, I had years of experience, and they had replacement pilots with 200 hours of flight time. The attrition curve favored our design philosophy." The captured P-40s tested by Japan remained in service through 1943, though flight operations were limited by fuel availability and the difficulty of obtaining spare parts. The primary aircraft at Akeno was reportedly destroyed during an American B-29 raid on the facility in early 1945, though Japanese records on this are incomplete. Comparative analysis with Japanese equivalents revealed stark philosophical differences translated into hardware. The Mitsubishi A6M0 Model 52, late war variant with limited protection, length 9.12 meters, wingspan 11 meters, empty weight 1,876 kilograms, maximum takeoff weight 2,743 kilograms. Maximum speed 565 kilometers per hour at 6,000 meters. Range 1,920 kilometers. Armament 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns. Pilot armor 35 kilograms when fitted. Self-sealing tanks not standard. Total protection systems approximately 45 kilograms maximum. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. Length 8.92 meters. Wingspan 10.84 meters. Empty weight 1,580 kilograms. Maximum takeoff weight 2,590 kilograms. Maximum speed 515 kilometers per hour. Range 1,760 kilometers. Armament 2 12.7mm machine guns. Pilot armor, 35 kilograms, late variants only. Self-sealing tanks, limited production only. Total protection systems, approximately 40 kilograms maximum. By contrast, the P-40E dedicated 214 kilograms to protection systems, approximately 400% more than late-war Japanese fighters and infinitely more than early-war Japanese fighters, which had zero protection. American pilot survival statistics from Pacific combat operations compiled from USAF records. When aircraft shot down in flames, 32% pilot survival. When aircraft shot down but not burning, 73% pilot survival. When aircraft damaged but returned to base, 96% pilot survival. Overall pilot survival rate across all combat damage scenarios, 68%. Japanese equivalents, estimated from captured records and post-war analysis, when aircraft shot down in flames, 8% pilot survival. When aircraft shot down but not burning, 45% pilot survival. When aircraft damaged but returned to base, 71% pilot survival. Overall pilot survival rate, 38%. The 30 percentage point survival gap represented the difference between the two design philosophies. American fighters were engineering solutions to the problem: how do we keep pilots alive? Japanese fighters were engineering solutions to the problem: how do we achieve maximum combat capability? Both were valid engineering problems, but in a prolonged attrition war, only one optimized for sustainability. The philosophical difference extended beyond engineering into strategic culture. American military planning emphasized force preservation and sustainability. Training infrastructure could produce 100,000+ pilots annually, but those pilots needed time to gain experience. Keeping them alive through their vulnerable early months created an exponentially more powerful force over time. Japanese military planning emphasized offensive spirit and tactical excellence. The cultural concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel rather than surrendering, meant protection systems could be viewed as defeatist thinking. The warrior tradition valued accepting death over seeking protection. This philosophy produced extraordinary individual courage and tactical innovation, but it also produced unsustainable casualty rates. Neither approach was morally superior, but one was strategically superior under the specific conditions of the Pacific War. American industrial capacity allowed building heavier aircraft. American pilot training capacity allowed replacing losses while building experience. American strategic culture allowed accepting short-term tactical disadvantages for long-term sustainability. Japan had none of these advantages. Their industrial base was smaller and under increasing bombardment. Their pilot training pipeline was excellent but couldn't match American scale. Their strategic culture was optimized for short, decisive campaigns rather than prolonged attrition. The captured P-40 at Akeno had revealed all of this in 1942, though the implications took years to fully manifest. The test data was accurate. The tactical recommendations were sound. Japanese pilots who followed the manual could shoot down P-40s effectively. But the strategic lesson, that survivability matters more than peak performance in extended warfare, was one Japan couldn't act on even if they'd wanted to. The path dependency of existing designs, production tooling, strategic culture, and resource constraints locked them into their philosophy. By 1945, the mathematics were undeniable. American fighter forces in the Pacific had grown exponentially despite losses. Japanese fighter forces had contracted catastrophically despite desperate production efforts. The difference wasn't just numbers of aircraft. It was numbers of experienced pilots. And experienced pilots came from keeping pilots alive long enough to gain experience. March 18, 1942. Akeno Army Flying School, Honshu, Japan. Captain Takeo Tanemizu's hand had traced those rivets, noting the weight of American armor. 3 years and 5 months later, The implications of that weight were written across the Pacific in losses Japan could never replace. The captured P-40 at Akeno never fired a shot in combat for Japan. It never shot down a single American aircraft. But it taught lessons that killed thousands of Allied pilots by revealing exactly how to exploit the P-40's tactical weaknesses. Japanese pilots who studied the Akeno reports knew precisely how to fight P-40s. Avoid the dive, force the turn, exploit the altitude limitations, stay out of the six-gun crossfire. The tactics worked. P-40 losses in 1942-1943 reflected the effectiveness of Japanese training. The manual was sound, the analysis was accurate, and the tactical recommendations were deadly. Yet Japan lost the war, decisively, catastrophically. The same aircraft that taught Japan how to kill American pilots also taught a lesson Japan couldn't learn: that in extended warfare, bringing your pilots home alive matters more than achieving tactical superiority in individual engagements. The P-40's armor, the self-sealing tanks, the 214 kilograms of protection that made it slower and less maneuverable, these were investments in sustainability that compounded over years of warfare. The irony extends further. The Flying Tigers achieved legendary status flying P-40s against Japanese fighters in China, not because the P-40 was superior, it wasn't, but because Claire Chennault taught tactics that played to the P-40's strengths. Hit and run, dive and escape. Use the armor and firepower to survive mistakes. Never turn with a zero. These tactics weren't about winning dogfights, they were about surviving to fight tomorrow. Japanese pilots, following their own doctrine of pursuing perfect tactical execution, killed themselves achieving local victories that meant nothing strategically. An ace who shot down 15 opponents but died on his 16th mission contributed less to Japan's war effort than an American pilot who survived 50 missions with 3 victories. Experience accumulated, knowledge transferred. The survivor could train replacement pilots with hard-won wisdom. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, P-40s were still in service with second-line units, though they'd been replaced in frontline roles by late 1944. The aircraft that opened America's Pacific War didn't close it. That honor went to the P-51 Mustangs escorting B-29s over Japan. But the P-40's contribution was foundational. It kept enough American pilots alive during the desperate early years to create the experienced pilot corps that would eventually dominate the skies. The examination at Akeno Army Flying School in March 1942 provided Japanese intelligence with comprehensive understanding of American fighter design. They learned everything about the P-40. Its speed, its weaknesses, its limitations, its tactical vulnerabilities. They created perfect doctrine for defeating it. What they couldn't learn from examining the hardware was why Americans made the choices they did. Why accept reduced performance for protection? Why add weight when weight was the enemy of aerial combat? Why prioritize pilot survival over tactical capability? The answers were embedded in American strategic thinking, industrial capacity, and cultural values that couldn't be reverse-engineered from examining an aircraft. America was building for a long war. America had the industrial base to compensate for weight penalties with more powerful engines. America had the training infrastructure to replace losses, but valued preserving experience. And America, perhaps, calculated the value of human life into its strategic equations in ways that produced different engineering solutions. The P-40 Warhawk wasn't a great fighter aircraft by the pure metrics of speed, maneuverability, or climb rate. It was outperformed by the Zero, the Oscar, and later by American fighters like the P-38, P-47, and P-51. But it was a great survivor. And in extended warfare, survival is the prerequisite for all other capabilities. The lesson written in 214 kilograms of armor and rubber-lined fuel tanks was simple. Wars aren't won by the side with the best aircraft or the bravest pilots or the most innovative tactics. Wars are won by the side that can sustain operations longer than the enemy can. Sustainability requires bringing your people home. Engineering for sustainability means accepting tactical compromises for strategic advantage. Japan captured America's fighter, flew it, analyzed it, understood it, wrote the perfect manual for defeating it, and still lost the war, because they understood the machine but not the philosophy that created it. The P-40 sitting on the ramp at Akeno in March 1942, with its heavy armor and sealed fuel tanks, was more than an aircraft. It was a statement of strategic intent. We're building for a long war, and we're going to win it by keeping our pilots alive. Captain Tanemizu, running his hand along those rivets, was touching the physical manifestation of that philosophy, though he couldn't know it yet. The captured P-40 didn't give Japan a new superweapon. It gave them something far more dangerous: knowledge of how to exploit American fighter weaknesses. That knowledge cost countless Allied lives. But it also revealed, to anyone examining it with strategic rather than tactical vision, exactly why Japan would lose. The aircraft that seemed heavy and sluggish was actually resilient and sustainable. The armor that seemed defensive was actually strategic offense, investing in pilot longevity to create an experienced force that only grew more powerful over time. In the end, the story of Japan's captured P-40 isn't about aerial combat tactics or engineering trade-offs. It's about two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, each logical within its own framework, each brilliant in its own way, but only one optimized for the specific conditions of the Pacific War from 1942 through 1945. The examination of that captured P-40 at Akeno Army Flying School provided the final proof. The P-40 Warhawk was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply prioritized bringing American pilots home alive over maximizing tactical performance. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why America won the Pacific War, while Japan, despite superior tactics, superior training, and often superior equipment, could not sustain the attrition required to win. The deadliest secrets aren't always the ones hidden. Sometimes they're the ones examined in plain sight but misunderstood. Japan saw armor and called it weakness. America saw armor and called it investment. History proved which interpretation won wars.